Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question asks if I can analyze the mental health and personality factors that may be at work with Albert DeSalvo. It is believed that DeSalvo is the Boston Strangler, but this has been disputed, and I'll talk about that in this video. Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I'll put the link to Patreon in the description for this video. So first I'll look at the background and the timeline of the crime, and then I'll move to the mental health and personality factors. Albert DeSalvo was born in Chelsea, Massachusetts on September 3, 1931. His father struggled with regulating alcohol intake and was extremely aggressive to members of the family. DeSalvo started committing crimes at an early age, like shoplifting. He also tortured small animals, a behavior that is tied to psychopathy. Albert was arrested at the age of 12 for battery and robbery. The next month, he was sent to the Lyman School for Boys. He was released 10 months later and took a job making deliveries. He would make his way back to the school in 1946 for motor vehicle theft. He would enlist in the Army after his release and was honorably discharged after one tour of duty. After this, he re-enlisted and was honorably discharged again. DeSalvo was arrested in 1955 for touching a young girl. The charges were dropped. DeSalvo would get married, and the couple would have a daughter. This daughter had a physical disability. His wife was frightened that she would have another child with a disability, so she made significant efforts to avoid sex. DeSalvo wanted to have sex several times a day. From 1956 to 1960, DeSalvo was arrested several times for breaking and entering. He was given suspended sentences. Even with his legal problems, DeSalvo maintained steady employment working as a press operator and a construction worker. One supervisor described him as a good, decent family man and a good worker. DeSalvo committed a number of assaults of a sexual nature. When I use the word assault in this video, that is the type of assault to which I am referring. It is believed he committed several murders in addition to this. Starting in June 1962, there were 13 murders in the Boston area over about a 1.5-year time span. The victims were all female, and they ranged in age from 19 to 85. Most of them were assaulted before they were murdered. The crimes took place in their apartments. There was no evidence of forced entry into the apartments in any of the cases. The perpetrator strangled most of them, but also used other methods to kill, including stabbing and beating. The last murder took place in January of 1964. The perpetrator was referred to as the Boston Strangler. In the fall of 1964, DeSalvo engaged in a series of assaults in the same area. The police referred to him as the Green Man or Measuring Man. He would knock on the door of an apartment, and if a young woman answered, he would say that he worked for a modeling agency. He told them their name was given to him as somebody who might be a good model. He said if they were proved to be a model, they would make $40 an hour, and they wouldn't have to do anything untoward. They would just be wearing evening gowns and swimsuits. This apparently fooled a lot of people. He would leave after this, of course, and not follow up with them, and several called the police to complain. In October 1964, DeSalvo posed as a detective in order to gain entry into a woman's home and assault her. Apparently, after that, he left quickly as he apologized. The description from that victim would later make it possible for the police to identify DeSalvo. DeSalvo was placed under arrest after trying to break into a house. He was connected to the other assaults at that time, but he was not the suspect in the Boston Strangler homicides. Even though he was not arrested for those murders, he confessed to them. One confession was given under hypnosis, which was induced by a famous mental health professional named William Joseph Bryan. The details that DeSalvo revealed in his confessions didn't really line up with the facts. In addition, there was no physical evidence tying him to any of the murders. DeSalvo's attorney was the famous F. Lee Bailey. Bailey negotiated a plea bargain which removed the possibility of the death penalty. DeSalvo was sentenced to life in prison for the Green Man assaults. Again, nothing related to the Boston Strangler. Bailey wanted DeSalvo to spend his life in a mental institution. DeSalvo would escape in February of 1967. He left a note behind on his bed that indicated he was trying to call attention to the conditions in the hospital, which is where he was at that time, and call attention to his own situation. He called his attorney 3 days later and said he wanted to turn himself in. The police arrested him in Lynn, Massachusetts. After he went back to prison, he recanted his Boston Strangler confession. DeSalvo was stabbed to death while in the infirmary on November 25, 1973. I guess the infirmary lost their workplace safety sticker for that month. July 2013, the authorities announced they connected DeSalvo to the assault and murder of a victim named Mary Sullivan. Some people who knew DeSalvo said he could not have been the Boston Strangler because he simply wasn't capable of committing those types of crimes. Yet they knew he committed the Green Man assaults. That part is not in dispute. Others have noted that the tactics used in the murders were diverse, suggesting that more than one killer was involved. I mentioned before the inconsistencies between DeSalvo's story and the actual evidence at the crime scenes. He didn't get the time of death right for several of the murders. He said that he strangled Mary Sullivan with his bare hands. In reality, she was strangled with her own stocking. Several victims who survived the attack said that DeSalvo was not the perpetrator. And many people believe that the Boston Strangler is a man named George Nassar. He was in the same prison as DeSalvo, and the two talked frequently. There's this theory that Nassar supplied information to DeSalvo so DeSalvo could confess, so they would split the reward money, which could be used to help DeSalvo's family. Now moving to the mental health and personality factors. Mental health professionals have had many opinions about DeSalvo. One professional who testified at his trial was named Dr. Brussel. He said that DeSalvo had schizophrenia of the paranoid type. Interestingly, he described schizophrenia as a split personality that causes somebody to lose touch with reality. This is a little confusing because there's also another disorder called multiple personality disorder. Now it's called dissociative identity disorder. Schizophrenia is a disorder characterized by psychosis, and multiple personality disorder is something really much different. People, in theory, have these multiple personalities, and usually they don't really remember too well what one personality does when they're in another personality. So I think these two got confused a bit at the trial. The defense made the argument that DeSalvo was terribly mistreated as a child. He was exposed to deviant behavior. The mental health professionals for the prosecution argued that DeSalvo did not have psychosis, so really a familiar type of situation we see in high-profile trials. It was reported that DeSalvo had the strongest sex drive that mental health science has ever encountered. It was referred to as an irresistible drive. DeSalvo's father was described as having a voracious sexual appetite. He would force DeSalvo and DeSalvo's siblings to watch him have sex with prostitutes. When DeSalvo was an adult, he would periodically be seized by what were referred to as little fires and little explosions, after which he could not eat. He would drive into the community and go inside an apartment building, indiscriminately pressing doorbell keys until someone would answer. That's the apartment he would go to. He would pose as a repairman to gain entry. At some point, the woman in the apartment would turn her back on DeSalvo, reminding him of how his wife used to turn her back on him. This would fill him with a feeling of hatred, after which he would attack. So this was really the conceptualization we saw at the trial. He had this drive that was irresistible, and he would go out and act on it in a disorganized fashion. DeSalvo's IQ was reported as 96, so just a little bit below average. Some have suspected that DeSalvo had both antisocial and narcissistic personality disorder. There's no way to know if he had the actual official disorders, but we see evidence that his behavior aligns with a number of psychopathic and narcissistic characteristics. For example, the fact that there was no forced entry and he pretended to be a model scout seemed to point to a tendency to manipulate. He was described as grandiose. He was loud and he would brag frequently. He lied quite a bit. Even his confession appears to contain many false statements. The crime scenes were very disorganized. Valuable items were left in plain sight. This points to impulsivity and rage. DeSalvo committed many crimes when he was young, and the severity of his criminality escalated. Some have described DeSalvo as a textbook serial killer. He was disorganized and had a great deal of rage during the actual attack, and he was motivated by a drive to dominate women. But DeSalvo was actually unusual in at least one way. He was conflicted. He confessed to crimes for which he was not arrested. He escaped from prison, yet turned himself in. Sometimes he felt bad about being a killer, like the time he left after an assault and said he was sorry. There was another time when he put a knife to a victim's throat, but saw himself in the mirror, so he fled because he didn't like the person he was seeing. With many serial killers, there's this sense that they are not comfortable with who they are initially, but at some point they come to accept themselves, even if this acceptance isn't typified by a deep level of insight. DeSalvo had not reached that point. Also, DeSalvo was unusual in that he did not target women based on physical appearance. Many serial killers target women of a certain age, height, weight, hair color. They may look for certain facial features. For example, Danny Rolling and Ted Bundy. DeSalvo didn't do this. Again, his victims went from 19 all the way to 85. And he said that attraction had nothing to do with his targeting. The last question I'll cover here is this. Was DeSalvo actually the Boston Strangler? I touched on this before. There have been many theories suggesting he worked out a deal with another inmate, George Nassar. There have been theories that the police fed him information. Let's look at the evidence both for and against DeSalvo being the Boston Strangler. On the side of for, even if the confession was not accurate, generally, when somebody confesses, it's reasonable to believe they could have committed the crime. In terms of the police feeding him information, well, the details in his confession were mostly false, so if the police did this, they really didn't do a good job. They should have paid more attention in the police academy course titled Helping Innocent People Confess. Then, of course, we see the DNA. The DNA connected him to Mary Sullivan's assault and murder. Of all the evidence that points to DeSalvo, this is by far the best. One could argue it's really the only compelling evidence of his guilt. So that was for. Let's look at against. The details in his confession were wrong. The police were not convinced he actually did it, and one would think that the police would be biased to believing he was the Boston Strangler. A few surviving victims did not identify DeSalvo as the killer. If DeSalvo was the Boston Strangler, he would have had to go from committing homicides back to assault. Serial killers almost always escalate from small crimes to assault, then to homicide. They rarely go backward in the severity of crime. Then there's George Nassar. This is the inmate who I talked about, who some believe conspired with DeSalvo. George Nassar was actually a good suspect. He hated women, he was considered psychopathic, and he was extremely intelligent, so he was certainly capable of manipulating Albert DeSalvo. Furthermore, it was known that Nassar had committed at least one homicide. DeSalvo had not been connected to any murders. There was no physical evidence. The circumstances of DeSalvo's death were suspicious. He was killed the night before he was going to talk to a journalist and ostensibly tell the journalist who the Boston Strangler really was. They never caught the person who stabbed DeSalvo. It is believed it was another inmate. DeSalvo was in protective custody. If the person was an inmate, they would have had to get through 6 sets of security checks. Now, even if this were possible, how likely would it be that this person who committed the murder would have never been caught? So maybe they could have reached him and stabbed him, but they did so with no one seeing. The prison authorities had a theory about the motive for the crime, even though they didn't know who the killer was. They said that it was a drug deal gone bad, or it was over a contested piece of bacon. So another senseless bacon-related homicide. How many times does this have to happen before we see large-scale reform in the area of bacon management? If we add in sausage and ham-related offenses, the effect on society is staggering. So either way, they really didn't know what happened. When you can't narrow it down between drugs and bacon, you're probably not close to the truth. So with this in mind, was DeSalvo the Boston Strangler? Well, there's no way to know, but I think it all really hinges on the DNA. If somebody believes that the DNA test was accurate, then it appears he was the Strangler. If there are some doubts there, if that DNA test was not good, then it seems like he probably was not the Boston Strangler. If DeSalvo was the Boston Strangler, then he really was not as close to a typical serial killer as many thought. Those are my thoughts on Albert DeSalvo. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be interesting. Thanks for watching. So another senseless bacon-related homicide. How many times does this have to happen before we see large-scale reform in the area of bacon management? If we add sausage and ham-related offenses, the effect on society is just staggering. It's hard to even imagine. This is really just more evidence that we need more vegetable-oriented programs in prison. For example, if you look at the chances that any particular person would be killed in prison, in this particular prison, it would be a lot more dangerous to be Porky Pig than somebody like the Jolly Green Giant, which kind of gives new meaning to Porky Pig's catchphrase, "That's all, folks," right? It's a little more morbid look at it. So I guess if Porky Pig was in the infirmary with Albert DeSalvo, he would have been sweating bullets. So I guess if Porky Pig was in the same infirmary as DeSalvo, he would have been thinking, boy, did I pick the wrong time to go to prison. Communities have drug diversion programs, but nobody has a bacon diversion program. It's like they just don't understand how dangerous bacon is. They just can't appreciate the damage it can cause to society.